lesson for November the 14th is entitled Tracing God's Hand, Trusting God's Heart. The key verse is from Romans 8, verse 28, which says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." The scripture is from Genesis 37, verses 2 through 11, and 45, verses 4 through 9. The lesson focus is God works through people to accomplish his purposes. In the overview, it says, in this first of 3 studies dealing with the life of Joseph, our focus is on Joseph and his brothers. It's a riveting story that begins in tragedy and ends in triumph, not only in his elevation to the second highest position in the land, but in the elevation of his spirit as well. The Joseph, who in his youth couldn't seem to stop talking about himself, became a man who couldn't seem to stop talking about God. The Joseph, who must have been tempted to hate his brothers, became, when he held the power of life and death over them, the reconciler who readily forgave. Through it all, he saw the hand of God at work in his life in both interpersonal and international affairs. The Joseph saga may read like a novel, but it's not fiction. It's history, and history is God's story. In the introduction, it says, John A. Redhead, a legend among Southern pastors a generation ago, once started a sermon by describing the Myers Park section of Charlotte, North Carolina. This rapidly growing area was a jumble of secondary roads and streets, none of which seemed to be laid out in straight lines. The key, Redhead said, was to learn Providence Road, the main thoroughfare from which most of the other streets and circles branched. "Keep your eyes open for Providence," he assured his congregation, "and you'll find your way through the most confusing tangles." His point, of course, was that divine providence does exactly that in our lives. It was certainly true for Joseph. Behind his changing circumstances was the hand of a changeless God. What about your circumstances? In part 1, it says that God is at work even when we don't realize it. And the text is from Genesis 37, verses 2 through 11, which says, "This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream. When he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, 'Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it.' His brothers said to him, 'Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?' And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. 'Listen,' he said, 'I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me.' When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, 'What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?' His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Well, it all started with a coat. Joseph's ornate robe was a clear signal that Joseph was his father's favorite. probably also suggested to his brothers that he would most likely receive the double portion of inheritance that traditionally went to the oldest son. Reuben, born to Jacob's wife Leah, the oldest of the patriarch's 12 sons, had apparently forfeited his claim by a sin that managed to be both morally repugnant and insulting to his father. The honor now might well fall to Joseph, who was the older son of Jacob's other primary wife, his beloved Rachel. To make matters worse, his brothers saw the young man of 17 as a snitch and a braggart, whose dreams of superiority were surpassed in arrogance only by his eagerness to share them. "Your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down," he told them after his first dream. After a second, he seemed to add insult to injury by including his parents. "The sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." His brother's hatred was unjustified, of course, but it was not unpredictable. After seriously considering murder, they decided to sell Joseph into slavery in Egypt and deceive his father into thinking that he had been killed by a wild animal. Ruining the offensive robe by drenching it in goat's blood must have been a particularly satisfying experience for them. Joseph, on the other hand, was alone with his thoughts on the long road to Egypt. Whether he was a spoiled young man or merely a naive one, he had triggered a vicious attack whose end result was unknown to him. He must have wondered where God was in all this. What of the covenant God had made with his great-grandfather Abraham? What of the promises God had made to his father Jacob and his descendants? What of Joseph's own dreams? In fact, God was keeping his promises at that very moment. Joseph could not have known of God's plan to preserve his people from a future famine, to show his power by bringing them to Egypt, and then to show his power even more mightily by delivering them from Egypt in the Exodus. Providence means God's hand at work in our world and in our lives, accomplishing his purposes. What Joseph thought deplorable was actually providential. It's not that Joseph and his brothers were pawns on God's chessboard. They had full freedom to make the decisions they made. Joseph to share his dreams with insensitivity, his brothers to lash out in rage and resentment. God, however, used the poor decisions that they had freely made to work out his greater plan. Though his hand is often hidden, it is always moving. God's providential care included not only Joseph, but also his brothers. In part 2, it says that God can work through our worst to offer us his best. And the text is from Genesis 45, verses 4 through 9, which says, "And Joseph said to his brothers, 'Come close to me.' When they had done so, he said, 'I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay." Few moments in all of literature can match the dramatic impact of the scene when Joseph revealed who he was to his brothers. A remarkable sequence of events had providentially brought them together. Still, more dreams, Joseph's rise to power, famine in the region, a brilliant rationing plan, dreams fulfilled as Joseph's brothers do bow before him, a series of tests designed by Joseph to reveal the motives character of his brothers. And finally, Jacob's reluctant permission for Joseph's full brother, Benjamin, to join his brothers on one more expedition to Egypt for food. Now they stood before Egypt's second in command, convinced that their lives, or at least the life of Benjamin, hung in the balance. Joseph's brothers had changed. They felt remorse for their treatment of Joseph, and Judah even offered to give himself as a slave in exchange for Benjamin's freedom. They were not the same men they had been. Joseph had changed too. The experiences of the past 2 decades had ultimately brought him power and wealth, but they had also taught him the humility that marks true greatness. Once a source of tension in his family, he had become the means of their survival. Speaking as a changed man to changed men, in the incredible emotion of the moment, he declared, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." This is Joseph's testimony of providence. You sold me, but God sent me. Wilbur Williams observed, throughout the accounts of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, we have God always close at hand, ready with a message, a vision, a covenant, a reassurance, a direction, and numerous promises to show that he was working in all things for the good of those who love him. This is no power of positive thinking cliche, no glib declaration that every cloud has a silver lining. Romans 8:28 is much richer, much deeper than that. It says that if we belong to him, God takes what we are given, even the evil that Satan intends as a blow against him, and makes what he chooses of it, always for our good and his glory. 4 times in this brief passage, Joseph credited God's providence. He couldn't stop praising the hidden hand of God. It should be noted, though, that Joseph cooperated with God at every stage of the story. God helped Joseph to reach the top, H.L. Ellison wrote, but Joseph helped God help him. Providence is not fatalism, with no role for us to play except waiting in resignation for a predetermined outcome. No, God calls us to work alongside him in his mission. He uses people to accomplish his purposes. In today's life application, it says, if you have made a bad choice or a series of bad choices in your life, Satan has no doubt tried to convince you that you have spoiled forever God's plan for you. Joseph's story is evidence that God is far more resourceful, persistent, and loving than that. Use this life application section as a spiritual journal to search for God's perspective. Revisit your bad choice. What was it? How has God worked in your life since? How have you helped God help you? How has our key verse, Romans 8:28, been true for you?